Welcome back. I'm going to quickly move us to, maybe I moved us out. Oh, wait a second. All right, never mind. I'm not going to delay it. I'm just simply going to introduce the next session, Narratives of Artifice and Technology. And if you recall, last night I showed a quote from Walter Benjamin, basically saying that technology is more mature than we are, or it has more power than we are able to cope with. And he was writing in the context of war, but it's meant as a provocation. Here to lead the discussion and to introduce the presenters is Clive Dilnot from Design Studies.
Well, all I have to do is to introduce the two speakers, but perhaps also say something about what I think might be the interesting way we could think of the relationship here. Let me speak about the two speakers, and then I'll actually say what I think might be the way we can actually think about this. Our first speaker is Chris Bull, who is a senior lecturer and senior research engineer at Brown University in the School of Engineering. He holds degrees in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and material science, teaches courses in industrial design, social entrepreneurship, appropriate technology, and sustainable energy. And his research includes work on technology and development, energy systems, and neural implants. He's the co-author of Appropriate Technology, Tools, Choices, and Implications, and the co-editor of A Field Guide to Appropriate Technology, both. Recent articles include rainwater harvesting in an Indian village, a difficult balancing act, employment, technology, context and change, and active microelectric neurosensor arrays for implantable brain communication interfaces. Right, that sounds good, pretty good. By contrast, Rama Chorpash is a creative designer. His practice focuses on intersections between people and everyday things. His work includes an array of project types, from an innovative office furniture system for Herman Miller to a celebratory roller skate disco in Central Park. He says that as a generalist industrial designer, developing benchmark products, quote, challenges him to express not only what role design plays in creating the useful and the poetic, but in articulating complex frameworks of practice. He's an associate professor here in the New School in Parsons, director of product design at Parsons. And he says that in his teaching, he cultivates a critical inquiry, exploring what products are, what they could be, and how they might tangibly positive change in an uncertain world. His work has been shown at the Museum of Modern Art here, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and Design Miami Art Basel. He's been featured in publications such as the New York Times Style magazine, Metropolis magazine, and the New Yorker. And he has one of the most last sentence is one of the most sort of enviable endorsements you could have. Elle Decor lists him as one of the 10 most influential people in design in the world. So there you are. What we are really looking at today, I think, and I'm going to put this in a deliberately light and a deliberately sort of trivial fashion, but also pose it as a kind of opposition. We're either looking at the triviality of design versus the seriousness of engineering, or we're looking at the seriousness of design relations versus the triviality of engineering relations. That's leave you to think about that.
Oh, I think, thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I teased Susan a little bit, and Clive to some extent, saying I wondered if maybe I was the token engineer in the crowd, and
But you're not.
but I'm not, and And actually, Jenny, I was happy to see yours, which had some of the flavors of sort of a scientific presentation. And just to put you at ease, I'm not going to give you a scientific presentation this afternoon, nor am I going to show you any slides, because I've learned that engineers showing slides in design conferences, it distracts people. So I won't distract you. And I'm going to start with the quote from Benjamin, because that's what I started with. So Susan sent an email, Susan sent an email after I had thought, I'll just sort of recalibrate that other presentation I did a few months ago, and that should be fine. And then I got this. There are two parts to it, and I'm just going to read the first part, and then we'll get to the second part. But the first part is, society has not been mature enough to incorporate technology as its organ. Okay, so society hasn't been mature enough to incorporate technology as its organ. And I'll give you another little piece from Susan that said she liked it because it addresses the gap between forces that technology puts in motion and our capacities to cope with, understand, and evaluate those forces. So, being an engineer, I hear words like forces, and it's hard not to go to the whiteboard and start writing equations. So you're going to see some of that. The other thing is coping with technology. So I'm not supposed to speak between here and here because he's recording back there, and they want the sound to be good on the recording. So we'll try to make this work relatively seamlessly. So I'm thinking that part of this sounds like things are a little bit out of sync, because the second part of the quote is, technology has not been sufficiently developed to cope with the elemental forces of society. So we've got a lot of words there, and they're fairly general words, and so parsing it into something that makes sense is one of the things that I struggled with. It reminded me a little bit of C.P. Snow and writing about the two cultures, and him saying that if let me cast myself in the role of technologist just for a moment. If I were to strike up a conversation around the second law of thermodynamics, it probably wouldn't go very far with most people. So part of this is about translation. So Ben-Amin talked about forces, and so when I hear forces, now you're getting the engineering translation. I'm thinking force equals mass times acceleration, okay? That's one. What else am I thinking? Second law of thermodynamics. I'm thinking that the change in entropy has to be greater than or equal to 0. And not only that, the title of this section is Narratives in Artifice and Technology. And I'm a literalist, so when I hear artifice, I think deception. Okay, and I don't think that was the way it was intended. Maybe it was. Anyway, I think that we put these things up here, and in some senses they are artifice because they're an abstraction of what the world really is. So they're our way of maybe making some predictive models about what might happen in the world. Okay, so technology, again, we've got definition problems, but we might break technology into two components. One that is at least based on current scientific theory, and the other perhaps on elemental forces of society that say something about the direction in which change happens. And I think the technologists might say that technology is to be wielded, to be tamed, to be bent to our will. In saying that, though, there's this tacit assumption that we all agree on what our will is, and I'm not sure there's consensus there. So I'm tempted to make this oversimplification and put in one corner someone, call them the engineer, saying that science and technology has the potential to solve whatever problem it is we face. In the other corner, we'll put someone saying that technology is the root of all our problems. Each corner can certainly trot out plenty of evidence to support their perspectives. The technologists might say, look at the wealth of information at our fingertips, the wonderful devices that allow us to communicate immediately across great distances, and our ability to travel great distances in relatively short times. In the other corner, and I'm not sure how to name this particular individual, who might say, look at our weapons that allow you to effortlessly kill. Look at your energy systems built on technology that is ruining the planet. Look at the abject failure of these and other technologies to bring people out of poverty. So, right, gross oversimplification of the way things really are, but the tension is there between these ideas, and the tension that is there in Benjamin in identifying sort of these two places that are a little bit out of sync. I want to get another little picture or idea. So, this may be complicated. Another idealization, right? So we like to think of forces acting on a body, and since we can't draw bodies exactly, we make peanuts that are supposed to look like the idealization of a body. And the thought is that we have forces, right, that act on them. Forces. And forces equal mass times acceleration. So another concept for you. So these are the things that you should have, high school physics, right? Should have, the idea of equilibrium. And equilibrium is when nothing moves. So it's kind of boring, but it's very stable, which is a good thing. So we say the sum of the forces is equal to 0, okay? So that the forces acting on this body, somehow we can add together and we get no motion. Well, that's boring, and it's usually not the way the world works. So we have systems that are dynamic where the forces are out of balance. The other piece that Benjamin talks about is the idea that they're moving at different rates. Okay, so we've got technology moving at one rate. We have these, I don't know what to call it, society, elemental, social forces moving at another rate. So we have an inherently dynamic system, which I think we'd agree is good, but there's some tension there. That imbalance makes it hard to work. So again, taking sort of the mathematical engineering liberty. So this is forces, the phrase is elemental forces of society. So these are forces elemental of society, right? So that's the way we think. And these are some maybe forces of technology that are causing that peanut to spin and dance and do what, oh, that's the wrong thing to go in there. And
You can try it.
do whatever. Oh, let's not even try it. So, back to the quote again for just a minute. And I'm taking some liberty because there was a talk last night where hodgepodge was said to be okay. So if this seems like a little of a hodgepodge, well, it's been licensed. Ben-Amin talks about taking technology and it being an organ of society. And so I'm a literalist, so I'm trying to figure out what it means to be an organ. So is this like growing a new appendage, that technology becomes like an arm on our body or something that sort of extends out into the world and we can do things with it, manipulate it? I wasn't happy with that image. I couldn't get it to work in some sort of organic way. So I thought maybe we should take it in a musical sense. So let's take the musical organ, and technology should be something that we can interact with the way Bach did with the organ. So with energy and understanding the nuances of what it is to work with it. And I could sort of make peace with that. We'll keep going. So the idea of maturing, so society wasn't mature enough to deal with technology. And technology and society are two dynamic systems, and they're linked by the uptake of technology by society and by the social conventions that affect those translating technology to wider use. So dynamic systems also have something called momentum or inertia. And that's another one of these struggles that we have where the inertias of one don't align with the other and they tend to pull things apart. And so I think that part of what he's trying to get at, or part of maybe what he's asking for, is finding ways to align the inertias of technology and these elemental forces of society. So I struggled with that one too, elemental forces of society. So I wrote that this is probably not a good question for an engineer. It is a good question, though. It is a good question, and I think one that we should try to answer. And I take the optimist perspective on this. Elemental forces maybe are represented in the UN's Millennium Goals. But then when I think about it, that's something different. Those are goals, and we're talking about forces, and forces to me are things that push or pull us in some direction. So I'll take it at face value and say that that's what it is. It's a force that pushes or pulls. It's like gravity. So these elemental forces of society. I need some examples really to work with. So we need to put some boundaries on society, and I think when we read it, we're thinking all humanity, and I think that what it's easier to deal with is a group that's got some agreed conventions about the way to live. So let's see. Characterize society as a group with shared common beliefs regarding social interactions. And let me give an example as the rule of law. Okay? So that would say that if there are laws that apply to a specific situation, we expect those in the society to follow those laws, right? And we tend to live our lives that way. So let me take the rule of law as an elemental force of society and say that Ben-Amin says that technology should cope with the elemental forces of society. So now we've got technology in a different role, right? That it needs to cope with these elemental forces rather than being the driver in the situation. So, sorry, I didn't like cope. I liked harmonize better, and I thought it tied in with the Bach at the organ as well. So if you'll give me harmonize, I'll keep going. Otherwise, I'll sit down. No, you're not so lucky. We get an example through this manipulation. And let's take what we might call an aberrant technology as an example. And I'm thinking of drones. And I'm thinking that they are disruptive to the rule of law. And I'm saying disruptive because drones enable those controlling the technology to act outside the rule of law. So the current debate on the issue of whether the executive branch has the right, is free to order drone strikes on American citizens who is accused of terrorist activities. This is disruptive because it circumvents the rule of law, which says that a person is entitled to a right to a trial, a fair trial. Ben-Amin seems to be asking that those developing technology consider such things as the rule of law and other elemental social forces during the process of developing technology. What about just living with the injunction of do no harm? That might be okay. I think that's a little passive for some of us. So that I think this idea of disruption is also important. So I think what we're asking is that we think about the consequences before we act. And in some ways, we're setting up an impossible task. And books have been written about the unintended consequences of whatever it is we do. So I'm gonna cut to my role of sort of an educator, I guess. I don't really like that term, but I teach engineering. And I think that part of this is talking about what our role is in having people think about these issues and think relatively deeply. And it comes to me in the form of questions that we might be asking. So one question that I struggled with was, what are those elemental forces of society? And we certainly could follow that by, is what I am proposing to do in harmony with the elemental forces of society? That's one perspective. But let's admit the subversive perspective as well. So ask that question, is what I am doing sufficiently disruptive so that it will affect some change that will push the elemental forces of society in a better direction? I'm going to use the first person on some of this to emphasize that individuals act, not institutions. And I know this is a good discussion to have here. But I'm talking about, we're teaching people how they should act in the world, and I think we have to go back to this idea that it's individual responsibility that somehow needs to play a part in this. All right, at this point I've twisted Ben-Amin far enough to say that those translating technology to the rest of us. And let's name names here. Engineers and designers should be asking these questions. And one of the roles of those charged with training engineers and designers should be to make certain that the questions are answered frequently. We might try to do this, but I'm afraid that the tendency is, even when they're asked, to let the answers be platitudes rather than thoughtful responses to that kind of questions. And I'm afraid sometimes I let people get away with those platitudes rather than forcing them and myself to deal with the more substantial issues that are there. Sorry, I've got to find the right place to jump back in again. One question might be, does the fact that we're part of a society, and we'll leave what that means up to your interpretation, mean we have some inherent filter about what the good elemental forces and what the bad elemental forces are? Is there some agreed upon moral compass? Is it a creed we say every morning that sort of gets us aligned with those elemental forces? How does it translate into action? How does that translate into artifact that lives in the world? We can talk about negative. Oh, I'm close. I'm close.
Great.
I'm
Brilliant.
No, that's good, because I wasn't paying any attention at all. Just let's try some negative elemental social forces like inequity, injustice, inhumanity. Does our translation of technology move us away from those forces? Does it move us towards liberty, equality, and fraternity? It was the technology of the guillotine that made the French Revolution possible. So I'm going to skip farther because I haven't put anything about what I do here yet, and I just a brief thing about how we try to get people to think about these ideas. So I'm just going to give you some short titles of prompts that we've given for design projects. So there's an area in Providence called the Jewelry District, and it's named that because the jewelry industry used to be there. There was also an interstate highway that ran through it, and they've recently moved it. So there's an opportunity for things to change in that area. So we do a studio that brings together engineering students from Brown and industrial designers from RISD, and we set them to work on tasks like this. So their prompt was, what can designers and engineers do in this district to push change in a more sustainable direction? So they have to act. Part of what they have to do is have a working prototype at the end of the semester that can be tested. So they have to act, and they have to take into account that some of these social forces need to be negotiated as well. We do things around energy. So what can design and technology do to make building occupants more mindful of the energy that they use? We're developing, and I'm sorry to use this word, a makerspace, just because that's loaded with all sorts of things too. But, oh, do you? Good. Okay, then I don't feel so bad. What can you design in there that embodies the ethos of trust that we want to have in this space? So I think one way that we get people to do this is to ask those questions and make them an element of the kinds of things that they're working on and thinking about. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
With the lecture we had last night, the opening lecture on feminism and Freud, I came home last night and thought I would add my own Freud quote around here and made some very quick changes. And Freud's notion was that a dream is a wish fulfilled, no matter what the dream is, meaning that you have to work through what other issues that you have in those dreams. And the question I have is design a wish fulfilled, no matter the implications to others? This is an image of Shanghai. Some of it's in progress and some of it is built. If you can see the bas relief of the mural behind, has anyone been to this building? It's an extraordinary building. On that bas relief, you would think you would find sort of communist workers, but what you find are rendered as massive bronze panels are people carrying the durable goods, which marks a new cultural revolution. I find that I show a couple of slides over and over again and say different things. And this is the view out my studio window. And part of this is how do we slow down the technology in which we're surrounded by. And this is an area of New York, North Shore of Staten Island, that for many reasons had just stopped and is now about to restart again. And so this is a question I have as a designer of how do we actually have perspective on the work that we're doing while doing it. And so sometimes that means moving out to the periphery. And so this is my garden in the back, and I don't eat from that garden. I love looking at all these community gardens. I don't know if they've tested the soil, but cities are not the right place to grow food. It's possible to do it, but it's typically pretty toxic. And I actually send these in every year to Cornell, and I have the soil tested. There's, New York City saw the Industrial Revolution. It was a center of the Industrial Revolution, and we're growing food in these soils. But for me as a designer, in terms of taking accountability of what I do, it's really a litmus of where I live. And I have a 3-year-old daughter when you take her back here. And so I think that as a designer, and looking at how are we connecting to this appendage of technology, it's this test of how do we witness ourselves in the world in which we're living. So while I give these tomatoes to neighbors that want them, and I sort of tell them they're up to you. They smell great. Lots of heirlooms. If you want, come out to my garden this summer. There's a lot of coal in that soil. And I'll show a few products here that I've designed, and I'm intentionally choosing highly consumerist products for this audience. So this is it's a transparent knife frame, but there's nothing transparent about it. It's eco-certified wood. It's produced in China, ultravioletly glued, very difficult to repair if you want to repair it, a little bit like an Apple computer. So there's a lot of issues in the desirability of this object which I've designed, which I'm very aware of as I'm doing it, trying to create a business plan for a company to start a business to sort of sustain itself. And it's very easy to be critical of these. I'm self-critical of it, but I also understand the operations of how a business functions. And there's degrees of consumerism. I have a knife which I bought in high school, a Wusthof. I've had it since high school. It's really the single knife that I use, and it's in pretty much the same condition as when I bought it. But you can buy salad in a bag. In fact, maybe you don't even need salad. We sell the Doritos, and you can get those as separate elements. But you can have Sierra Crisp salad. It's pretty clean. We've seen what's happened with these large sort of Costco organic salads, but a lot of questions around the implications of technology and the implications of scaling up, which is a really critical question in design that we don't typically talk about in this audience, is what are the implications of scale in technology? Does anyone know what this is? So this is a product I designed, which I did user studies with and gave it to people and put it in their hands and said, do you know what this is? And they held it in different ways and did surveys to study what it was. And it had a very particular intention, and it was very interesting to hear what those responses were. A huge amount of engineering. So it's made out of a glass reinforced nylon. Those two blades have a shearing action, and when they're injection molded, they sort of tweak in and create a springing action. A lot of invention went into this product. And it's a salad cutter. Do we need a salad cutter when you can have a single Wusthof knife? You can be in touch with your vegetables that you're getting. Apparently we do, and apparently there are people that don't like to touch food. This is not the sort of research done behind it, but when it was brought to me by a client, it was a double-handed chopper. This is a product I developed at Echo Design while I was there. It was this double-handed chopper, and they wanted to call it the toss and chop. And I said, why would anybody want to chop their food? I mean, don't you want to control the shape of it? Don't you want to, have contact with your food? But they seem to love it. I asked other people. A lot of other people are excited about this idea. And so also context is critical in what our desires are. But in analyzing it, I saw very quickly that leisure was a big part of this. It's people that don't want to learn how to cut. And to engineer a pair of scissors that you can't cut your fingers on, but you can cut a tomato or an onion with is not an easy thing to do. So I engineered this, got this to work. I was very dubious of it, and they wanted to sell it in Williams-Sonoma, and I said, you're really going to need to sell this in QVC. You're not going to sell that to Williams-Sonoma. And we wrote out a sort of plan, and they launched it at QVC. It was one of their largest selling products at QVC in their history, and it's been canonized now at Williams-Sonoma. It's been on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So it was on, it wasn't on Make This, but it was on the Discovery Channel Invent This. So it's along those same lines of why are we making this, and what are the implications of it? There were product extensions. So when you scale things, you get to make more things and more things. And as a designer, it's one of the reasons I came to education. Not that this is a bad project, but I would like to control the projects which I work on to pay other people to work and to sort of do that. And so this is one I don't typically share, and I don't, it's not that I want to disconnect my name from it, but it doesn't carry the idealism that I like to have. That said, this next image is something that was extraordinary to me. This is the Helen Keller Institute. And on their independent living aids is the toss and chop. And the founder of the company started getting letters from one-handed people, and it is one of the single most important items for people living with disability with one hand. Not my intention as a designer. Certainly in my tenure package, I'll write that this is fully my intention. And that behind the scenes, I was trying to change the world with this one. What's important here is to recognize as a designer, we are not in control, as Clive puts it, that we have a sense of what we're doing, although we can be in control of our integrity. So while I had a lot of issues with the project, I approached it with a great integrity of actually solving these problems, trying to do no harm in the project, trying to make things recyclable, trying to do everything I could, but secretly carrying a double agenda. And I think most designers that are conscious that work in a commercial realm find it very hard to put everything on the table together and negotiate that. And that's a challenge, and that's what the university is for, that's what graduate education is for. But the real world is a different world, and this is very difficult to navigate these areas. This was a submission from last year to an open call to the Museum of Modern Art to design in America, produce in America, actually design in New York. It was called Destinations New York. And so I designed a potato masher because people in New York don't cook. I cook, you cook, and you need a potato masher, but many people don't cook. And the innovation here was really around technology. So it was looking, how could we produce in cities for cities? And so this is a virtuosity of CNC wire bending. The curatorial team absolutely loved it. And as I researched it more, I said, it's actually very difficult to produce, and I'll have to produce it in Baltimore. And they said, that's great. And because it's not to be produced in New York, it was to be produced in America. It took me a long time to get there. There was a time when I was going to produce it in Mexico, relabel it to be made in America. And I sort of got through that. And I was told by the curatorial team, if you make this, this is the kind of thing that we would put in our permanent collection, which is a big challenge as a young designer that you can have. I mean, I've had a number of pieces in the museum. I don't have anything in their permanent collection, but to have something in the permanent collection, you know, that's what you want. That's what I couldn't achieve. So these are the machines that make it. Not this exact machine, but there are many machines. And this is a big question of our time with technology is what is the purpose of making? Not the purpose of the products, but what is the purpose of making? How does it engage with labor? How does it engage with other flows? And what I found was in New York, I'll just jump forward, this was the person that made my potato masher what it became. This is one of the largest industrial spring companies in the world, but all they could really do in Brooklyn was to prototype it. And if I were to make it, I would have to make it outside of New York. And it was very important to me that it actually be made in New York. So I made the decision that it wouldn't be in the permanent collection, although it did show in the museum. It was in the Rockefeller Garden, and this is all, you know, great. But this is what it ended up being. And ironically, this iteration of it, and I went through maybe 20 iterations, harkens back to that conversation we were having earlier about the machine art show. And so I took a form, which I think we still haven't dealt with, and that are the implications of actually making and products, and how do these two entities relate to each other. So it's completely Cartesian in its bending. It can be both automated, although it's, or handmade. It has a lot of invention in it. It's made out of spring stainless steel, so it actually has a spring-back quality to it when you push on it. So instead of it being a monstrous hybrid like you would have with maybe an OXO good grips, where you might have multiple materials together. Oh, that's one material. That's sandapine, and you can pull the handle off for recycling. It's made out of one material, although this is a heirloom object, hopefully. And again, scale is critical here, that it scale up. And then it ends up in a venue selling. This is also a part that we don't think about in design theory so much, but the role of the transaction and the criticality of the transaction. The first time I had work show in MoMA was a collection for Herman Miller, and I had a collection of furniture also done with eco design that was there, and another collection next to it, another collection next to it, and there were no prices. And I actually couldn't believe it, that we had worked to create something that could be made in a couple of days, shipped in 3 days, and you could buy it for a few $100s, made pretty sustainably, and there's no price on it. And how can you really judge the implications of the work without that? And I'm going to end with this slide. And it's even a bigger question. This is a slide from when I lived in Brazil. And this is a pan repair person. There's knife sharpeners. These activities still exist in the United States and globally. But everybody had their pans repaired in Brazil, whether you were rich or poor, because you had servants in your house. And those servants were actually a relationship to the made world. And while we feel we don't have servants here, we are continually served, and we're surrounded by servants, but they're invisible. And in fact, as we have products and we have no contact with the products we have to that larger supply chain, we have no way of knowing what that supply chain is. And so my question around products is, how can we actually look at these service models, not as antiquated models, but how do we actually reconnect with humanity? And so these are challenges as a designer that I'm interested in discussing and looking towards. And that's where I'll end it. Thank you. And I do have one quick joke about engineers and industrial designers. It's not a joke, it's pretty serious. There was a race, a great race at Stanford. The industrial designers had been up for nights trying to work through ideas, not a lot of evidence in the work that they were doing, asking a lot of questions. The engineers came to the race, the gun fired, the engineers pulled out the calculators, the industrial designers ran.
On that note of trying to be unkind to technologists, which is what we all really love to do, I'm going to throw this open to questions and debates around here. But I'll just make a couple of comments that maybe we can play off of here. One thing that I think both, working from both the Benjamin quotation through to the last slides that we had here, is our continuing ambiguity in terms of the things that we make. That we're actually kind of, in a certain sense, we are not sure about these things. We're not sure how they sit with us or what our relationship to them is. Whether, in fact, technology is, if you like, ours, technology are us, or technology is kind of over there. We're still not sure about this, and we're kind of uncertain about it. The next thing which has come out for me is listening to this talking, and these not particularly in any logical order, they just simply came out of the conversation, is the relationship between power and technology and power. And the way that technology objectively contains power and deals with power. It is itself powerful. But the paradox here, which I think Chris is partly addressing, is that technologists often sort of have an attitude that they're powerless in the face of power. So that this objective entity, technology, is itself a kind of individual action is relatively powerful, relatively powerless in relationship to it, except for simply aiding and abetting that technological power. And that becomes an excuse for not acting. On the other side, we have design, which knows itself to be inherently powerless. And actually, in knowing that it's powerless in the face of power, uses this as an excuse to be powerless, if you see what I mean. So we've got on both sides, the persons who deals with the artificial, who deal with making, who are to some extent powerless in relationship to that making. I think we've got to start to think that. Now that then links to another point, which is partly brought up by Rama when, in passing, he said, he referred to the notion of asking what is the purpose of making. And that strikes me that one of the conditions that we have created for ourselves in the kind of making we have, technology especially, is that there is a kind of inversion here. If we think of making today, we think of axiomatically technology as the frame of making, and almost as making as a subset of technology, and design as a subset of making, and of craft as a subset of, something like that. But when you think about it, that's almost exactly inverted from the real human condition. The real human condition is making, of which technology is merely a specialist moment of that. In a sense, a kind of historic moment of that. So there is a question here about inversion and how we grasp that. There's also a question about technology and economics, which Rama was alluding to here, and kind of in a sort of designerly way sort of stepped around it, mentioning it and not quite mentioning it, which is how all designers I've ever known deal with economics. We deal with it, but we don't really want to do it, and please don't ask us to think that we're really part of capitalism. On the other hand, design is essential to industry being profitable. It's an ambiguity that is never resolved. It is probably never resolvable. But one thing one does notice here, and Rama was brave enough to kind of bring out the ambiguities here, was what I would call the consumer displacement of design configurative ability. In other words, the intelligence of the object, the toss and chop object, is almost inverse to the value of the object, except for one-handed persons. If we take one-handed persons out of the equation, it's very valuable for them, but not very valuable for anybody else. But the design configurative intelligence, the investment, if you like, that's put into it is quite extraordinary. So here we have a kind of inversion of ability, and we could say that there is a human sadness here. There is a sort of a colossal waste of what I will call configurative ability going on here. And that's something that we might actually think about, and how we would think in the future about how it is that we marshal on a much wider scale those configurative abilities and those abilities to actually attune technological forces to human demands. So, having floated those ideas, let's now open this up a bit to the audience. Who wants to jump in? Please. There must be questions arising. Rude comments to technologists? Rude comments to the designers, please. Let's have an argument.
This might be a bit of a tangent, but part of what I'm thinking about as you're talking about these products and making and consuming is we're in a privileged position where we can come and start thinking about the implications of these things. But to many people in the world, some of these products are still either at the survival mode and or signifiers of class mobility. For example, I live in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and there are many shops that sell cheap new clothing, as opposed to Park Slope, where there are a lot of vintage shops. And I think that really illustrates the point. So what's my question exactly? I don't know, but how do you think about that when you're designing?
Well, I think most of the world doesn't have access to mass consumer products, and in many ways, a lot of those communities have a I would argue a tighter cohesion and meaning in the community, and so what I'm arguing, where I would like to also see products go, is that we actually create systems to regain the supply chain that those communities have. And so I think when you're talking about sort of equity and value, in the image I showed earlier of the bronze with people carrying appliances, I'm not sure that we all need that. And so I would actually argue that, and just as you're talking about accessibility to a thrift store, to have that knowledge to be able to do that, I think these are things which designers can help to build and to foster. And so I think the different strata in which designers work, we need to be able to move between those more fluidly. And so I think that that's a challenge. And I intentionally chose very, very commercial projects to show. There's a lot of other work that I could have chosen, which in some ways would have been accepted a lot, in an easier way. But I thought it would be a challenge to choose things that were very commercial. I don't know if I've answered.
I guess I'm thinking about the stories we tell about products, and that there's the most overriding story is that the products are, talking about progress and higher social status, and it's a kind of question for me: what narratives, if you will, we can tell about products or build into products that will do what you're saying. Like, how are you going to convince someone of a low income that it's better for them to go to a thrift store? They just want to get away from the thrift store.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's through the authenticity of the experience. So I think that that's a difficult leap, but there's a lot of opportunities where people actually are engaged. I mean, we invited Heath Ceramics from who I don't know if you're familiar with the company in San Francisco, but a teacup is maybe $35 from them. But they produce in San Francisco, they produce in Sausalito. They don't have distribution outside of that. The people that work there walk to that place, and people go there in the Mission District that can't afford a $35 coffee cup, and they buy it because it's part of that community. And I think that if we build authenticity just as you have with a bakery or you have with food, so this works very well with food because it's, there's this existential thing of being connected to that sustenance. But, just as we saw with the salad bag, we don't really need restaurants either, but we choose to have restaurants. We can have all of our food shipped to us. We can have these models, but somehow with products, they're so platonically perfect, we accept that we can buy them from the internet or we can get them other ways. And I think it's critical that designers start to take charge of that. And living in Latin America, I think all of you have seen how beer bottles are reused. And now for marketing, countries like Brazil are not recycling them anymore. And the design companies like Heineken, many of these are great companies. Heineken has a huge nonprofit arm. They do a lot of corporate, CSR. But they're not creating a campaign around the value of those bottles. And I think it's what you're talking about. Like, while we look at that in the developing world and say, why can't we have that here? The developing world is losing that. So I think part of that is that we need to lead in this world so that it becomes, like a pair of blue jeans in Brazil, and they're not changing the entire, waste stream of the country just because they want to have a shiny bottle.
Another good example of that is my daughter, who's 13, just bought a pair of totally worn out jeans.
I'm a little concerned that we want to somehow reify that slide. That we want to make the beer bottles, like you're saying, Heineken might celebrate the use of their beer bottles. Okay, but you also can't, I don't believe, ask people to freeze their cultural aspirations. Anthony Appiah writes about it beautifully, that, we want to keep this authentic. There's nothing authentic, cultural preservation. That's like saying, we're going to freeze you over here. One of our students is doing a great paper or thesis on Indian craft and how very well-intentioned companies want to make sure that the West doesn't come in and say, oh, that's better for Saks if we make it blue. And in doing so, they are freeze-framing Indian craft in a little vacuum. So I worry about that a little bit.
That's not at all what I'm presenting.
Okay, then I misunderstood.
What I was arguing is actually about accountability and relationships between people, whatever form that takes. And so that can have a very contemporary look to it. It can have a very different way of doing things, but we have lost, in many ways, our connection. So when I moved back from Brazil, I was shocked that I didn't know the people that were serving me. So I would, you go to the, Lewis Hyde talks about this in The Gift, where you go to your dry cleaner and you pay not to know your dry cleaner. You go to the restaurant and you pay not to know the person that's serving you. And all of these interrelations, which you can talk about in very simple terms like dry cleaner, restaurant, we understand. When we talk about it with a product, it becomes even more complicated. And you think, well, that's actually made by somebody and that there's a relationship. And so it's not the nostalgia of this image, although this is how most of the world actually is. And this is how we are too. We just don't know who these people are that are serving, that are creating this. And all of these, worlds exist because other worlds exist. So my argument is, how do we open the spectrum of a larger supply chain around design so that we can look at it not as an artifact, but as a series of relationships that that you can more transparently see.
So are those the questions you were asking as well, that we have to make engineers and designers more
Cognizant, but I want to go back to this slide a little bit, because I think your point about this being for repair, but this is also, in a lot of the world, the mode of production.
Yeah.
So in the informal sector, almost all of it is made by hand by someone that you know. And so that relationship is there. And those societies tend to have trust as one of the bedrocks of what they do, and sharing. And So in some senses, we've jettisoned that possibility by separating ourselves from the place where things come from.
Yeah, I mean, the example that you gave of Sunset Park, which, have you been to Industry City, this area? Which is, I mean, it's a double-edged sword if you have friends that are artists. They've had, I guess, 4 dozen artists move out. Yeah, and I mean, there are people that had $1 a square foot, so there are big implications. However, it's incredibly exciting to see MakerBot Industries take 200,000 square feet. And this is a company that could be setting up, Bree Pettis said to the city of New York in a dinner we were having, he said, I want to understand why economically I should do it in New York, because I can do this in Las Vegas, where there's no port, nothing. And this is what makes economic sense. And people are making decisions to actually do it, even though it's a lot more expensive, because they believe in creating a different kind of community, and they realize that the very product they're making is a community. So his company was bought for $350 million, not because of the technology, but because there's a community of people that are interested, that had buy-in. It was open source for a long time. So I think that this is not a developing world question. It's a question of actually having purpose in all worlds. And
I have a sort of a different question. I think it applies to both of you. Would you turn down, do I really need this? I don't really need this. Would you turn down a design challenge because you didn't agree with the purpose? And it extends, to products, but it also extends to, in engineering, some fusion. I don't know, something that is a perfect design challenge, but that's about social forces, and it's also about ethical forces.
Personally, you're asking me, aren't you? And I'd say yes, I would turn some things down because I felt like they weren't doing the kinds of things that I thought were important. And I can even think of examples that people think are good projects that I would decline because they aren't good enough. And I don't mean to be critical about that. I just think that we have to be careful what we choose to work on. I mean, we've got a limited amount of time, and we ought to be spending it in a way that ends up net positive.
yeah, and I unfortunately, from my pocketbook, turned down most projects at this point. And one of the reasons I started actually doing things for cooking is it was an area I felt very little guilt in, because encouraging people to eat and cook and take care of themselves is a great thing to do. But I think there's so many things we can work on. And also, I think there's a big shift that needs to happen in design of working outside of the commercial sphere. I mean, as Clive was positing, that we have these incredible skills, and to relegate that to commerce is tragic when, it's. So I think these are big questions as a designer or an engineer that we grapple with, is how do we contribute, in greater ways. But I think, just as I think that design or engineering, I think all fields are equal. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you do. It's how you contribute and what you want to contribute in. And I think we all deal with the same ethical questions.
It's just interesting because you did with that chopper, you did actually design something that, you're thinking, I'm just going to make this the best I can make it. And it did have this purpose that you didn't foresee, which is also
Right.
what Clive has been talking about. So, there's this funny balance between, I might turn down this project thinking I don't like what the intended purpose is, and it may actually have a purpose that is.
Yeah, and this is a project I did maybe 10 years ago. And what I was also trying to say is we can't create categories of integrity. So when you do take on a project, I believe needs to do it with integrity. Even if you see that there are issues, we don't know what the outcome of our work will ever be, no matter what we think it is. And if we don't do it with integrity, at least, it could be double-edged. It could work really well and be used for a horrible thing. And you say, well, why did I design that so well? That's...
Why didn't I do a bad job?
Yeah. Well, this was a point that was brought up with what was the gun? There was just an anniversary of the AK-47, and the designer was talking on NPR about this and the conflicts. And that was actually the first project I turned down in college. I was asked to design a gun handle manufacturer came to me, and I actually took the gun home, and I'm going to an art and design school. I grew up with hippie parents. My first name was Love, and I thought, I'm going to design a gun handle. That sounds good. And I called them and said, I can't do this. And the next one, I was living in Brazil working in advertising, and I was asked to design a package of cigarettes, and I said, I can't do this. And as a designer, those are black and white. It gets more complicated even designing a pair of scissors because there's huge ethical questions.
I have a question / thought, because you mentioned this a moment ago, this idea of trust, which is a very sort of emotional, psychological, I think, thing. And when we talk about design, I was thinking about like some of the commercials that are like these pharmaceutical commercials that are like, just all over the place right now, where you like Zoloft, and they do this one thing, but then everything else that they do is destructive. But I find it really interesting that these pharmaceutical companies are producing more and more commercials and more products that do the one sort of like thing that is helpful, supposedly, in this large library of things that are destructive. And so is it, we're talking about changing how we approach, our craft as designers, or, but there's a psychosis in the market, just in general, with consumers who are willing to take part in this very destructive conversation. I'm just wondering. I've been asking and wondering myself, how do we deal with that? How do we inject some consciousness into the consumer, framework? I don't know.
I mean, that's something that I think it's working with people that you share values with. And I think it is, and it does sound, one could see it as very hegemonic, but design does have a huge effect on changing the world. And in terms of like what you put out, especially in number, becomes, it's like film. I mean, you can argue, but when you put out 25 million units of something, it changes. And so I think it's working with people you share values with. And I think as a designer, or however you're working, again, like you can have your agenda and then you can look at their agenda, or you can say we actually share values here. And I think these are difficult questions, and it might mean that you don't have capacity to do things that you thought you could do if you make those decisions. But I think that one of the reasons I continue to practice in the commercial sphere is it has such power. I'm also an artist. I do art projects. I do a lot of different things. I do, participatory design, and I've worked in parks, in Philadelphia. I love that. But there's something about seeing when you have a huge shift, and you can actually see the cultural shift happen, and so it's very attractive, but also.
Yes, thank you. I think a great example to add to this argument was actually offered yesterday in the presentation of Lance Wyman, who created that identity for the Mexico Olympic Games. So he worked actually for a rather oppressive regime at the time, and obviously had some scruples about this. However, his system was so open-ended and so coherent in a way that it was possible for students and other dissident elements to appropriate that exact system for their own ends, to in fact comment on the regime and help to criticize the regime. So what I'm trying to say here is that the idea of just refusing the project and walking away is maybe it's a too easy way out, and it's nothing to be proud of anyway. What has to be done is to approach a project in such way that it would be possible for other people, for other groups of consumers to reuse it, rethink it somehow later, and perhaps contribute to the discussion.
Yeah, go ahead.
It occurred to me, actually, one of Jamer Hunt's not with us, but he's director of the MFA design program. One of his students became a good friend of mine, one of his students from Philadelphia. And she did a project on the different uses of the keffiyeh scarf. And it wasn't the intention was to just give information. She rethought it because it was being rebranded by Urban Outfitters. And so she made these labels that explained her reinterpretation of the scarf. And it occurred to me that based on, Kareem just gave me, an idea that other people have tried. Yes, those commercials for Zoloft are horrendous, finding out your stomach lining might fall out or whatever. But in fact, virtually anything that uses resources and volume should have warning labels.
Yeah.
I think we need those warning labels because otherwise, of course, no manufacturer is going to agree to it, but there ought to be a sort of, to take Constantine's theme up, a critical response, and maybe, some sort of consumer sticker program where consumers, ask for these labels. Or I just find it amazing that we don't consider the deleterious effects of these things.
Yeah, she was actually my student. I was her thesis advisor on the project, and a lot of that project also dealt with a notion I shared with her from Silda Morales, who's a Brazilian artist who looks at, during the fascist dictatorship in Brazil, the circuits of distribution were a neutral thing. And so he put questions on Coca-Cola bottles, which went back into distribution, and used the distribution channel of Coke to ask very difficult political questions. One of his largest collectors happened to own Coca-Cola Latin America later, great supporter of the arts. And there's the irony that it's not them and us. It's like, as Tibor Kalman says, it is us, and that them equals us. And so my challenge is not to look at otherness, but how do we actually affect these circuits of distribution? Is there possibility to insert other things in our work? Is there not? How do we make that assessment on what we take on? And so you see people like, what is his name? Dean Kamen, who invented the Segway, who says he invented the Segway so people could stand in wheelchairs. He invented the portable dialysis machine. He's invented a way to purify water, and it's funded by Coca-Cola. I'm not sure I could do that because it's such a complicated thing, the privatization of water. But the intention is to give away water. So these are big questions. But certainly being in the field of being able to have the capacity to implement, either through design or engineering, puts you on this knife edge where you actually have to make decisions. And it's easy to step back and sort of critique it. But when you're there, we would love to have guidance from all of you in design theory about how to make those decisions, because they're difficult decisions.
I'd just like to ask one last point about really scale. And we often in these kind of design discussions, the discussion kind of goes back into often quite small scale objects, because that's where everybody in the kind of, let's say, the art school tradition feels most comfortable with. And yet clearly what we really need to talk about is scale, actually, and how on earth we design technologies at global scale to be also humanly and sustainably compatible. So if you could both answer that difficult question in about 45 seconds each, we'd be very grateful.
So, I'm sorry, Clive, and maybe this is the argument that you're spoiling for, but I don't think we should do that. I don't think we should scale things to some universal level, because I don't think there are products that belong in that space.
I don't think I'm talking about products. I think I'm talking about technical systems.
Technical systems. Well, so to me, I guess as an engineer, a technical system is one of my products or something like that. So this idea, I guess what I'm responding to is the thought that there are some things that can be applied universally. And I guess I struggle against that. And you're looking at me like I should give you some good justification for that struggle. And I think it's the context in which things exist is important. And I think that changes depending on where you are and what community you're in. And so I think these methods of production, that we've spread across the world are things that I would like to see go away as quickly as possible. And yeah, I'll stop there. And
Well, the way I would answer the question is that I think we need to think about what are the appropriate scales to the question. So, for example, the potato masher, although it looks highly industrialized and has capacity to scale, it was produced by a single person who was very excited to produce it for the museum. And after that scale was done, I stopped the production. And so it's not produced now. And this was the appropriate scale for it to talk about these relationships, and it doesn't need to do more than that. And I think that making in cities again needs to happen as well. I mean, this is how cities were built, this is how communities happened. We don't need to be shipping things all over the planet. We can actually have greater accountability if we can witness to things that are happening around us. But everything is a mystery to us, and we sort of offshore everything we can, and whether you're ordering food and calling in. And so my question is, how do we inshore more? How do we actually take accountability for the things around us? And these are very difficult questions in terms of economics. But in the end, I think it solves a lot of questions which we're struggling with.
well, I think if we all cheered when the price of oil goes up, so it makes the economic argument for offshoring things more difficult to make, that helps with the problem.
Okay, shall we? Thank you both very much.